Think in your heads right now, how many of the 330 million Americans do you think live in poverty? Do you think it's 1 million, or 5 million, or maybe even 10 million? Well, according to the 2020 United States Census, there are 37.2 million Americans living in poverty. 37.2 million. That's 1 out of every 9. A population greater than any state except California, greater than our 23 largest cities combined. Why do we, the wealthiest country in the world, fail to provide a reasonable standard of living for so much of our population? Why can't we fulfill a goal explicitly written in our Constitution to promote the general welfare to ourselves and our posterity? Why couldn't we? Our efforts toward fighting poverty began in 1873. With the publication of Henry George's groundbreaking book, Progress and Poverty, the reality of American poverty was brought to light. This led to the progressive era, where our first efforts towards combating poverty were made, of which the most significant is a nationwide housing reform pushed in response to Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, which revealed to the public the living standards within urban areas. When the Great Depression brought a surge in poverty 60 years later, Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with his New Deal programs. By providing relief in the form of Social Security, unemployment support, and economic reform, his policies were revolutionary in lifting millions of unemployed Americans out of poverty. Another 30 years after the Great Depression, Lyndon B. Johnson was preparing another series of policies known by many as his War on Poverty. His method of combating poverty consisted of 4 initiatives. 1, to expand Social Security to include health insurance. 1, to fund the construction and maintenance of primary and secondary schools. 1, to provide food for the economically disadvantaged. And 1, to provide vocational training and jobs in order to promote employment. In many ways, Johnson's War on Poverty is a success. In 1964, the year he wrote his legislation, the poverty rate was at 19%. A decade later, that fell to 11.1%, equivalent to lifting 12.7 million out of poverty. However, his War on Poverty was, in several ways, a failure. He promoted it as a cure for poverty, despite helping a minority of the population. This has, in part, resulted in a lack of additional policies aimed at poverty since. Because poverty has remained throughout our population growth, the current population of Americans in poverty is barely any smaller than the population that he had written his legislation for. It'll be great if I can end this with a simple, let's have another war on poverty, but unfortunately, the characteristics of poverty have changed so drastically in the decades since that the policies of the past are simply unable to provide the effective, long-term alleviation necessary for a truly permanent solution to it. Let's come back to the 37.2 million statistic from earlier, because that number actually downplays the extent of poverty. The official definition of poverty is simple. Every year, the Department of Health and Human Services surveys the country to determine the average cost of food in Alaska, Hawaii, and the 48 contiguous states. For a family to be considered living in poverty, they must have an income that is less than 3 times the estimated cost of their food. Why 3, you may ask? Because studies conducted in the 50s showed that the average American household spent 1/3 of their income on food. Even though food went from being 1/3 to 1/10 of the average family's budget, the line is still set at 1/3. As a result, the line is drawn far below the actual income necessary for a family to leave poverty. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services defines a family of 4 living in the 48 contiguous states as out of poverty if they make more than $2,300 a month. Isn't that ridiculous? Here in the Bay Area, that would be little to spend beyond housing. In fact, the only states where a family of 4 could reasonably live on $2,300 a month are in South Dakota, Arkansas, West Virginia, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama, the 6 states with the lowest living standards. But even with an outdated definition of poverty, there are still more problems. One of which is isolation, which is quite significant. When many of us think about poverty, we think of tent cities, that are located in urban centers. But the truth is, urban areas are not the most poverty-prone areas. In a report by William O'Hare published in 2009, Americans who live in rural areas are in fact 30% more likely to live in poverty than those in urban areas. As a result of urbanization, a shrinking agricultural sector, and a lack of interest in expanding infrastructure in rural areas, many Americans who have lived in rural regions ended up migrating to urban areas instead. Meanwhile, those who cannot afford to migrate are left behind until they fall into poverty. It didn't help that poverty is seen as an exclusively urban issue by the vast majority of discussion in recent decades, which has contributed to its obscurity. But rural poverty is a significant group of the poverty population, but it is not the most significant. That may actually be those who are at risk of entering poverty. Under a more general definition of poverty as the lack of social mobility, as much as 3/5 of the US population could be considered in poverty. In a 2022 poll conducted of 3,500 households nationwide, 60% of them live paycheck to paycheck. In other words, their ability to maintain a reasonable living standard ends once they cannot afford the necessary expenses. While it is a stretch to claim that 60% of Americans live in poverty, it is no stretch to say that if nothing is done, most of us will end up living in poverty sooner or later. It may seem like a problem too big to solve. It's not a problem that originates from a single law or a single group, or even has a single target. It's a problem that has existed for over a century through many forms. It would not be enough to simply re-implement another New Deal or have another war on poverty. A permanent solution should instead account for the realities of those living in poverty right now, rather than at a time of past policies. Since the 1960s, there have been many major changes within our society as a whole. One of the biggest is the transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy. This is not unusual in itself. This is a progression that first world countries go through. But what is unusual is the form of service labor done. On one side, you have highly skilled labor, such as those working in research or in medicine or in education. But on the other side, you have low-skilled laborers, such as those in retail and transportation. There's a decisive difference between these sides. One is able to use their contribution to society as a justification for a better living standard, while the other is on the verge of being replaced and does not have that same privilege. It makes sense that those who make up highly skilled labor force are also those with the living conditions that facilitate social mobility. The same makes sense on the other side as well. Those who make up the low-skilled labor force alongside the remains of our manufacturing laborers are also those who are either already in poverty or are slowly moving down the social ladder towards it. With this, we can point to one major source of poverty: the inability to obtain an education necessary for skilled labor jobs. Rather than just rebuild New Deal work programs, which are costly to maintain and only provide temporary employment, we should build schools that make jobs rather than hand out jobs. Rather than simply expand welfare, which costs trillions of dollars annually to run and only provides short-term support, we should give them a way to generate income rather than simply providing income directly. Rather than merely giving away homes for the homeless, we should construct a system that can benefit everyone, not just a specific demographic of the poverty population. So what should we do? We should create a project to construct and maintain hundreds of trade schools across the country to provide an accessible, affordable, and useful education in skilled labor jobs, such as in engineering, construction, and more, to give those unable to improve their lives the ability to improve it themselves, to allow them to build their own businesses, to allow them to bridge the gap between the uneducated workers and the educated workers, where prosperity favors the latter. If you give someone a fish, you'll feed them for a day. But if you teach them how to fish, they'll be fed for life. By providing the means by which they can live meaningful lives is to effectively bring them out of poverty. The truth is, we are nowhere near building a society without poverty, yet the first step towards solving a problem is always to acknowledge it. If we spread the word to others about how poverty weakens our society, if we communicate and platform those who live in poverty and let their realities be known, if we petition and let politicians know about how poverty exists around them, then eventually we may finally realize our poverty-free society. A new era of progress would come. May we fulfill a founding purpose to promote the general welfare in the United States of America. Thank you.